Hey guys, tonight we descend into the rank, gritty, and gloriously awful world of medieval labour. A time when your job title said less about your career path and more about your risk of plague and burns. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's say you're born in medieval England, and your career dreams are modest. You don't want to be a knight, too stabby. You don't want to be a monk, too quiet. So you take the path of least resistance. You become a gong farmer. Gong, in case you were wondering, is not a musical instrument here. It's medieval slang for human excrement. And a gong farmer was the lucky soul who got to remove it. From latrines, cesspits, privies. Wherever medieval people relieved themselves after a hearty meal of turnips and regret. You worked at night, not because the job was mysterious, but because it was so offensively pungent that townsfolk preferred not to be reminded of your existence during daylight. You arrived with a shovel, a bucket, and possibly some last shreds of dignity. You descended into the pit, sometimes waist deep, sometimes further, depending on how productive the town had been. The good news? Gong farmers were actually paid well, sometimes more than carpenters or thatchers. The bad news? You earned every coin while marinating in centuries of communal shame. Now, health and safety weren't exactly priorities in the 1300s. Cesspits could collapse, methane could ignite. There are recorded cases of gong farmers passing out from fumes, slipping into the muck, and dying in what can only be described as the worst obituary ever written. As for tools of the trade, a wooden bucket, a long-handled scoop, occasionally a donkey, not for companionship, just to haul the cart of waste out of town. The waste was then dumped in designated lay stalls or used as fertilizer, because nothing says organic farming like medieval bowel movements. Socially, gong farmers were avoided. You didn't exactly get invited to banquets, but some found camaraderie among fellow night soil collectors, probably while competing over who had the worst day. The smell? You didn't get used to it. You just stopped complaining. Eventually, it became part of your personality. So yes, the gong farmer may not have wielded a sword or worn a fancy hat, but they kept medieval cities from drowning in their own digestive legacy. They were the unsung heroes of sanitation, one bucket at a time. And if that sounds bad, don't worry, it gets worse. Let's say you're not cut out for urban cesspits. You want something more natural, outdoorsy, involving wildlife. Congratulations, you've just become a leech collector, the proud medieval professional who spent their days wading through bogs to harvest nature's little vampires. The job description was simple. Step into a pond, stand very still, and let leeches attach themselves to your bare legs. That's it. You are the bait. You attract them with your warm blood, your poor life choices, and your resigned expression. Once the slimy suckers latch on, you yank them off and drop them into a jar. Repeat until you feel faint from blood loss, then head home for a nice nap and a probable infection. This wasn't just some fringe occupation either. Leeches were in high demand, thanks to medieval medicine's favourite treatment, letting people bleed. Got a headache? Leech it. Melancholy? Let's drain some joy out of you. Plague? Surely you just need slightly less blood. Barber surgeons loved leeches like modern influencers love ring lights. They were essential, and that meant someone had to collect thousands of them. Enter. You, the walking charcuterie board of the swamp. Protective clothing? Not really. Most collectors worked barefoot and bare-legged, often women or the very poor. The lucky ones wore a skirt. The unlucky ones wore welts. And if you were really unlucky, you'd come home with leeches still attached, growing plump and smug beneath your knees. And the hazards didn't stop at blood-sucking. These weren't sparkling, clean garden ponds. We're talking muddy, stagnant water filled with bacteria, frogs, and the occasional judgmental goose. You risked tetanus, trench foot, and trench shame. As for payment, a pittance. Maybe a few coins per dozen leeches. Maybe food. But mostly, you got the satisfaction of contributing to the fine art of bloodletting and the slow-motion downfall of patient health. On the bright side, you were unlikely to get mugged on the way home. No one wanted to get that close. So you've tried human sewage and parasitic pond duty, and you're thinking, what's next in this soul-crushing career ladder? Well, how about burying victims of the Black Death? That's right, you, dear viewer, are now a plague barrier. Because in medieval times, death didn't wait for job interviews. This job came with 3 main requirements: a shovel, a strong stomach, and a complete disregard for personal safety. Protective gear? Please. At best, you might have a rag soaked in vinegar tied to your face. At worst, you had nothing but your own optimism and some garlic someone swore would repel evil vapours. When the plague hit in the mid-14th century, people dropped faster than common sense at a witch trial. Entire neighbourhoods emptied overnight. Corpses piled up in streets, homes and churches. Someone had to move them. That someone. You. Mass graves, or plague pits, became your daily office. You'd spend hours digging trenches wide enough to toss in entire families. Sometimes there weren't even coffins, just bundles of limbs, hastily wrapped in cloth, occasionally accompanied by a chicken for good luck. Or maybe it just wandered in. And don't expect gratitude. People avoided you like, well, the plague. If you showed up in the marketplace, everyone suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. You were considered bad luck, bad smell, and potentially contagious, a medieval triple threat. Now, the work was endless. No weekends, no holidays. The plague didn't take breaks, and neither did you. The worst part? You knew that every day on the job was a gamble. Many buriers became what they buried, especially after a sneeze or cough from the wrong direction. Compensation? In theory, the town council might toss you a few coins or stale bread. In practice, you often got paid in continued existence. On the plus side, there was a sense of grim purpose. You kept cities from collapsing under the literal weight of death. But let's not romanticize it. You were basically playing Tetris with corpses, while wondering if that weird itch on your arm was just fleas or fate. Welcome to the glamorous world of medieval textile production, where fashion met fermentation, and you, the humble fuller, made sure nobody's wool tunic felt like a cactus. Your job? Simple. Stomp on cloth soaked in human urine until it felt soft enough to pass for clothing and not medieval sandpaper. You see, raw wool is oily, stiff, and clings to everything like an unpaid intern. To turn it into wearable fabric, it needed to be fulled, a process involving soaking the cloth in a pungent cocktail of water, earth and, yes, urine. Why? Because stale human pee contains ammonia, which helped clean and soften the fibres. Why you had to stomp in it for hours? Because machines hadn't been invented, and your feet were apparently God's gift to the medieval textile industry. Now, this wasn't a gentle toe dip situation. You were knee-deep in a vat of fetid liquid, pounding fabric with your feet like a winemaker who took a very wrong turn in career planning. And you didn't just stomp once or twice, you did this for hours, daily, for years. You essentially lived in a footbath of medieval BO and regret. The stench? Legend. So much so that fulling houses were built far away from towns, not for zoning regulations, but because no one could stand the smell of your profession existing within smelling distance. And let's talk health. Between trench foot, ammonia burns, and mystery rashes with names like God's Curse, your body was constantly rebelling. Oh, and if your shoes got soaked too bad, they'd probably dissolve by the end of the week anyway. As for social standing, let's just say fullers didn't headline feasts. You were tolerated, like rats in the pantry, or that one cousin who won't stop talking about herbal medicine. Still, there was some job security. People always needed clothes, and wool was king. So long as humanity sweated, itched, and wanted to look slightly less like wild goats, your services were in demand. But at what cost? You weren't crafting couture. You were soaking your toes in other people's bodily fluids, hoping no one ever asked you what you did for a living over dinner. And yet somehow, things still managed to go downhill from here. Let's say you've had it with fluids, bodily or otherwise, and want a job that's dry, technically. Congratulations, you've just been promoted to treadwheel operator, the proud labourer inside a giant wooden hamster wheel. But instead of getting a treat at the end, you get chronic joint pain and a mild existential crisis. You worked primarily in cathedral construction, lifting massive stones skyward with the power of your legs and a complete disregard for spinal health. Picture a crane, but the motor is just you walking in circles like a confused pilgrim. Medieval engineers thought, what if we took a giant wheel, stuck a guy in it, and pretended physics wouldn't notice? And thus, the treadmill crane was born. The wheel was often suspended high above the ground, which means you weren't just walking in a wheel. You were walking in a wheel of death, 40 feet in the air, lifting stones heavier than your entire extended family combined. Lose your footing? Gravity takes over. It's no longer a construction site. It's an impromptu funeral. The rhythm of your day? Walk. Walk some more. Occasionally stop so someone can shove bread into your hand, then walk again. The wheel squeaks, the rope creaks, and your knees develop opinions. And God forbid your co-worker in the second wheel gets ambitious and starts walking too fast. Suddenly you're in a medieval spin class from hell. Safety standards? Non-existent. You were lucky if the axle didn't snap. Occasionally someone forgot to properly secure the counterweight, and entire loads of stone went crashing down like the metaphor for your career. Was the pay good? Not particularly. You were paid in not being crushed today, which, back then, was a pretty decent benefits package. You might get some stew at the end of the shift if you still had enough energy to hold a spoon. Still, you were part of something grand. A cathedral. A monument to faith, art, and architectural ambition. People would marvel at it for centuries, though probably never sparing a thought for the sweaty human wheel hamster who hauled the stones into place, muttering about his aching ankles. But hey, at least you weren't stomping wool in pee anymore. Progress. So you're tired of walking in circles and lifting rocks the size of marital regret. Maybe you want something with more movement, more drama, more risk of being bitten by something with fleas and bad intentions. Welcome to the glamorous life of a rat catcher, the unsung hero of urban hygiene, assuming you define hero as someone who runs at rodents with a stick and poor decision-making skills. Rats were everywhere in the medieval world. Grain stores, infested, taverns, overrun, castles, basically just upscale rat condos. And the solution to this plague of vermin wasn't poison, traps, or science. It was you, a person with a net, a dog, and a blank stare that says, I've seen things. Your average day involved crawling through dark, cramped spaces under buildings, chasing rats with nothing but your hands or a small club. Sometimes you used ferrets, sometimes terriers, sometimes pure desperation, all while trying not to get bitten, scratched, or sneezed on by the walking biohazards that scurried past your boots. And let's be clear, these weren't Disney rats baking pies in someone's kitchen. These were disease-riddled, plague-carrying, rage-filled medieval rats. They lived off garbage, fought each other for bread crusts, and probably had better health insurance than you. The tools of the trade? A burlap sack, a torch, and possibly some boiled leather gloves that offered about as much protection as a soggy napkin. If you were lucky, you had a dog trained to sniff out nests. If you were unlucky, you had a torch and a lot of yelling. Pay? Let's just say nobody's getting rich chasing rats. You might get a few coins per tail. Yes, per tail. Which meant you had to bring proof of your rat conquest, like a grim medieval loyalty program. Occasionally, towns would hire rat catchers during outbreaks, especially when people noticed an unusual number of corpses and fleas doing the cha-cha. But once the panic died down, so did the budget, and public respect. about the same as a puddle. No one wanted to sit near you, talk to you, or hear about your day. But deep down, everyone was relieved you existed, because without you, the rats would inherit the earth, or at least the pantry. Let's say you want to work indoors. Maybe you like kids. Maybe you dream of courtly life, silk robes, and eating something that wasn't boiled in sadness. So you take a job in the palace, caring for a young noble. Sounds cushy, right? Wrong. You're the whipping boy, a living, breathing punishment proxy. In short, the prince misbehaves. You get whipped. Yes, that was an actual job. See, noble children, especially those of royal blood, were considered too important, too sacred even, to be physically punished. Can't bruise the future king just because he fed gunpowder to the cat. So instead, they appointed another child, often of lower status, to be his constant companion. And if the prince broke the rules, you took the lashes, in front of him, while he watched, hopefully with guilt, but usually with snacks. It was a strange form of moral outsourcing. You were supposed to be so emotionally close to the prince that he'd feel bad watching you get flogged. A cute theory, unless you were dealing with a budding tyrant who thought your screams sounded like music. Your day involved shadowing the royal child. At lessons, meals, riding, swordplay, you were his confidant, his study partner, and, on bad days, his scapegoat. If he sassed his tutor, you got the rod. Failed his Latin, hope you like bruises. Threw a tantrum, better start limping. There was no career path either. You didn't become senior whipping boy or deputy of the lash. You just aged out, assuming you survived without permanent spinal curvature. Surprisingly, some whipping boys did become lifelong friends with their royal tormentors. After all, nothing bonds two kids like the shared memory of one being beaten for the other's misbehaviour. Others, however, disappeared from the records, probably after walking off into the woods and deciding that friendship isn't supposed to hurt this much. Pay, room, board, and maybe the occasional thank you note. No one built a statue to a whipping boy. But if you were lucky, you got to wear clean clothes and eat from the prince's table before being thrashed for his food fight. So you've grown tired of rat bites and royal beatings. You long for solitude, fresh air, and a job that doesn't involve actual children or rodents. Enter the lime burner, a man so committed to dust inhalation he made chimney sweeps look like wellness influencers. Your job? Burn limestone in a blazing hot kiln to produce quicklime, a vital ingredient in everything from mortar and plaster to agriculture and, fun twist, corpses. That's right. Quicklime was occasionally used in burials to speed up decomposition, so your handiwork was everywhere, in walls, on fields, and quietly dissolving Uncle Geoffrey behind the church. The process involved stacking layers of limestone and fuel, wood, peat, or if you were particularly eco-conscious, dried dung, into a massive oven called a lime kiln. Then you'd light it and bake it at hellfire temperatures for several days straight. And by you, I mean you stood next to it, shoveling materials and occasionally poking it with a long stick like some medieval pizza chef, if pizza exploded your lungs and caught your tunic on fire. Breathing near a lime kiln was a bit like hugging a volcano while snorting chalk. The fumes were caustic, the dust was everywhere, and there was always the risk of spontaneous combustion. One gust of wind and you were coughing up masonry-grade phlegm while your eyebrows quietly disintegrated. Protective equipment? You had a rag over your mouth if you were lucky, and a pair of wooden clogs if you were living large. Gloves? Please. You had calluses thick enough to register as armour. Worse yet, quicklime reacts violently with water, so if it rained or you accidentally sweated too hard, the powder could hiss, bubble, and burn straight through your skin. Nothing like being slowly dissolved by your own profession. Social life? Minimal. You smelled like scorched earth, looked like a haunted chimney, and your lungs made noises like a dying accordion. But on the bright side, people respected your work. You made the foundations of buildings and occasionally helped create plague pits. That's practically a resume. Still, each shift brought you closer to becoming a lung-shaped pile of dust. Let's say you want a job with flexible hours, fresh air, and minimal supervision. You don't mind working nights, dislike authority, and aren't squeamish about corpses. Congratulations, you're perfect material for a resurrectionist, otherwise known as a professional grave robber. But not just any grave robber. You're not stealing rings or gold teeth. No, you're after the whole body. For science, of course, totally academic. Please ignore the shovel and lack of soul. In the late medieval period, medical schools began demanding human cadavers for dissection. The problem? The church frowned on dissecting bodies, and legal channels for obtaining corpses were tighter than a miser's coin purse. Enter you the resurrectionist, the entrepreneurial middleman between freshly buried and anatomy lecture. Your nights began in the cemetery, where you'd quietly dig up the newly interred under cover of darkness, ideally within 48 hours, before things got too squishy. You worked fast, like a morbid speedrunner, often with a partner. One to dig, one to keep watch, and both to pretend you weren't about to yank a grandparent out of retirement. You didn't bother with coffins. Too heavy, too loud. You'd smash open the lid, pull out the body, and leave the valuables behind, sometimes. It wasn't theft, you argued. It was science-adjacent recycling. Of course, not everyone appreciated your role in medical advancement, families, for example, and the church, and the local constabulary. If caught, you could face a fine, imprisonment, or public shaming, though rarely execution, which seems ironic considering the amount of corpses you handled. Some towns began adding booby traps to graves, iron cages, heavy stones, even explosive devices. Yes, really. Nothing says rest in peace like a spring-loaded jaw trap guarding your femur. But the demand never stopped. Doctors needed cadavers, and you were cheaper than a legal alternative. Sometimes you even had a standing order. One adult male, relatively intact, no visible plague. Payment? Decent, especially for something that required no training beyond own a shovel and be dead inside. You earned more per body than most peasants saw in a month. Ah yes, the groom of the stool. The job that proves no matter how glamorous court life may seem, someone still has to deal with the king's exit strategy. If you're wondering whether the title is metaphorical, it's not. Your full-time royal duty is to assist the monarch during his most private of private moments, when he sits upon his portable, velvet-lined, gold-trimmed toilet box, the stool. And your job? Help him wipe. Let that sink in. This wasn't just some medieval prank gone too far. No, it was a respected position. In fact, the groom of the stool was often a nobleman, trusted implicitly by the king. Because when you've seen someone naked, sweating and mid-grunt, you've achieved a level of intimacy few courtiers could rival. You didn't just wield cloth, you wielded influence. You controlled who got access to the king during his seated meetings. You managed his wardrobe, correspondence, and even advised on policy. It was a weird power dynamic. You were simultaneously the royal janitor and chief confidant. The job required discretion, loyalty, and a truly unshakable stomach. You might also be in charge of preparing the stool, ensuring the privy linens were fresh, and keeping the royal bottom powdered, perfumed, and presentable. Medieval kings didn't just rule, they pooped in style. Naturally, you were sworn to secrecy. Leaking royal bowel movements to the tavern crowd would be a career-ending move, and possibly a head-ending one. Still, court gossip being what it was, your knowledge of the king's diet and digestive habits made you a walking medical report, and a surprisingly popular one at that. As gross as it sounds, the position paid well. You lived in luxury, dined at the king's table, and sometimes received land or titles, all for being literally indispensable in the royal bathroom. Still, it's hard to brag at parties. Oh yes, I'm the reason the king doesn't chafe. Not quite as flashy as knight or chancellor, is it? So you fancy yourself a chef in the Middle Ages. That's adorable. Forget Michelin stars. You're aiming for a meal that doesn't actively harm anyone. As a medieval cook, your job was less about crafting exquisite cuisine and more about preventing gastrointestinal war crimes. You weren't working with the freshest ingredients. You were working with the least rotten ones. The stuff that smelled mostly fine and only twitched occasionally. Your tools included a giant cauldron, a wooden spoon the size of a battle axe, and a blazing fire that either burned your stew or your eyebrows. Sometimes both. Recipes, please. A medieval recipe was usually something like, take meat, boil it, add a handful of herbs, pray. Quantities were vague, instructions were worse, and if someone complained, you just told them it was peasant style. Working in a noble household meant fancier expectations, and fancier ways to hide spoilage. Spices like pepper, cinnamon and cloves weren't for flavour. They were for masking the taste of doom. If the meat still moved, you just added more saffron. Problem solved. Poultry. Had feathers until 5 minutes ago. Fish. Hopefully not still blinking. Everything else went into pottage, a one-pot mush of vegetables, barley and meat scraps boiled until it surrendered. The real horror, however, was feast day. Hundreds of guests, dozens of dishes, all prepared in a dark, smoky kitchen where the ceiling dripped grease, the dogs licked the floor, and sometimes the food, and one scullery boy was always mysteriously missing. You were responsible for elaborate subtleties, sculptures made of sugar or meat shaped like swans, dragons, or saints. That's right. You had to build a saint out of pastry and still find time to boil 50 cabbages. If it collapsed, guess who got blamed? Not St. John the Melty, that's for sure. Burns, cuts, infections and food poisoning were all part of the job. There was no refrigeration, no health inspector, and no sympathy when the Lord's pigeon pie exploded. Still, if you managed to not poison anyone too important, you might just keep your job. For now. Bon appétit. So you're not afraid of a little hard work. Maybe you enjoy the outdoors. Maybe you think lifting heavy things will give you biceps worthy of a church fresco. Welcome to the life of a quarryman, where your job is to fight rocks. Literally, and the rocks usually win. As a quarryman in medieval times, your day began before sunrise and ended only when your arms stopped responding to commands. Your task? Cut, smash, and haul gigantic chunks of stone out of the earth with nothing but rudimentary tools and the sheer force of poor life choices. No fancy drills, no hydraulics, just hammers, chisels, wedges, and a deep personal vendetta against granite. You'd start by hammering iron spikes into natural fissures to split the rock, which worked, eventually, if you hit the same spot hard enough, often enough, while your hearing slowly retired from existence. For extra fun, you could pour cold water into hot cracks to try and shock the stone apart. Because when your job involves thermodynamics, it's a good sign something has gone terribly wrong. Dust? Everywhere. In your lungs, your teeth, your bread. Safety goggles hadn't been invented, so you squinted and hoped today wasn't the day a rogue flake of limestone introduced itself to your cornea. Let's not forget the real thrill, cave-ins and falling slabs. One wrong tap and you could trigger a domino effect of screaming, scrambling and a very awkward workers' compensation hearing, which back then was just a priest saying, well, he died doing what he hated. Your reward? A few coins, a sore back, and the knowledge that your stones might one day become a cathedral, or a dungeon, or a privy wall. Legacy. If you were lucky, you'd be assigned to quarries near limestone or sandstone, the soft rocks. If not, you might find yourself chipping away at granite, which is about as forgiving as a tax collector with a hangover. Social status? Somewhere between background character and local ghost story. Romance prospects? Only if someone was into perpetual grime and conversational wheezing. But hey, at least you didn't work indoors. So you think you've got a good cardio routine? Try being a wartime messenger in the Middle Ages. A job that combined marathon running, high-stakes diplomacy, and the constant risk of being mistaken for an enemy spy with really bad luck. Your job description was simple. Carry vital military information across miles of enemy-infested terrain without getting shot, stabbed, trampled, eaten, or arrested. Think of yourself as a medieval USB stick, but with worse encryption and a much higher mortality rate. Speed was essential. You had to move fast enough to outrun horses, outwit bandits, and occasionally shout the phrase, "Don't kill me, I work here," in multiple languages. If you couldn't run, you rode. But horses made you more visible, and visibility in a war zone was not what you wanted unless you were a flag. Your deliveries? Battle orders, secret troop movements, surrender demands, or awkward letters explaining why the king's reinforcements were 3 weeks late and very drunk. If intercepted, you might be tortured for information. If caught by your own side during a uniform change, you might be mistaken for a spy and hanged before you could even say, "Wrong camp, sorry." Weather didn't care. You were expected to gallop through storms, mud, snow, or scorching sun, all while keeping a scroll dry and legible, because nothing says logistical failure like ink soup. Sometimes you delivered messages during the battle itself, weaving between clashing lines to inform one commander that the left flank had either collapsed or wandered off in search of lunch. Archers? Didn't care. Cavalry? Couldn't see you. Everyone else? Too busy stabbing each other to hear, "Please don't skewer the guy with the parchment." And if you survived the delivery, guess what? You got to go back. Pay? Not bad, if you were fast, discreet, and had a sixth sense for danger. Survival odds? Slightly higher than being a catapult projectile, but only slightly. Still, for all its risks, the role had a strange nobility to it. You were the fragile thread holding armies together, the voice between kings, the guy who sprinted while everyone else ducked. Because nothing says hero quite like carrying bad news at full speed. Ah, the blacksmith, the medieval town's human furnace, part craftsman, part magician, and full-time sweat fountain. If it involved heating metal until it glowed like the sun, and then hitting it with a hammer until it begged for mercy, you were the person for the job. Your workspace? A forge hotter than a knight's armpit in July, filled with soot, sparks, and enough noise to scare off any notion of peace. You didn't need a rooster to wake the village, just the rhythmic, skull-rattling clang-clang-clang of your daily metal opera. Blacksmiths made everything. Horseshoes, plowshares, swords, nails, armour, hinges, and about 600 other objects that people broke weekly, and they all wanted them yesterday. Oh, mighty blacksmith, my ox threw a shoe. Oh, great hammer holder, my gate hinge squeaks. I need a new sword, this one's too bendy. Everyone loved you, until you charged them. Then suddenly, they remembered Brother Thomas makes nails on the side. Your body, calloused, burned, deaf in one ear, and your dominant arm was roughly the size of a tree trunk. Romantic prospects weren't bad. You had muscles and permanent coal eyeliner. But small talk was tough when every sentence was followed by a coughing fit and a mysterious burst of flames from behind you. Let's talk danger. Red-hot metal, exploding sparks, iron that cracks instead of bends, anvils that don't care about your toes, bellows that occasionally catch fire because why not? One distracted moment and your beard becomes a candle. And if you worked for a castle or army? Congratulations. Now you're mass-producing weapons for impatient men who solve disagreements with axes. Hope you like deadlines enforced by sword. But despite it all, the blacksmith was essential. You were the backbone of technology, the town's answer to "can you fix it?" Long before engineers, you were designing tools. Long before influencers, you were shaping trends. You made the stuff people needed to survive, and occasionally look impressive while doing it. Still, you never got statues. Just more broken metal, and a customer asking if it'll be cheaper, without the decorative curls. Ah yes, the bard, the wandering performer, the poet with a lute, the medieval equivalent of a podcast no one asked for, but couldn't turn off because they were staying in your lord's hall. Being a bard sounds romantic, until you realise your job is part musician, part gossip, part court jester, and full-time cold and hungry. You wandered from town to town with nothing but your instrument, your verses, and a suspicious cough. You sang of kings, of battles, of doomed lovers, of dragons that were probably just overgrown lizards, anything to earn a coin, a meal, or at the very least, not get pelted with turnips. Every gig was different. One night you'd be serenading nobles in a candlelit hall. The next you'd be dodging drunk peasants in a smoky tavern as someone shouted, "Play the one where the knight gets eaten." And you had to, because that song paid in bread. Your biggest challenge wasn't remembering the lyrics, it was surviving the politics. One wrong word about the Lord's haircut, and suddenly you're the subject of the next execution ballad. The line between clever satire and treasonous insult was razor thin and heavily patrolled. You were also expected to memorize history, which, in medieval terms, meant whatever the person paying you wanted to be true. Did Sir Godfrey win the battle? Doesn't matter. If he's buying your dinner, Sir Godfrey absolutely crushed it. And hygiene? Let's just say bards were known more for mood than scent. Lice, fleas and boots with holes were standard. Your clothes smelled like firewood and failure. But you made up for it with charm, wit, and an unnatural ability to rhyme sword with bored. Still, you held power. You shaped public memory. You spread news faster than a town crier with a megaphone. You were medieval PR, but with more stringed instruments and less shame. Occasionally, you'd strike gold and become a court bard, living in a noble's house, writing songs for weddings and war campaigns. Until you rhymed honour with goner and found yourself back on the road. So yes, the bard's life was romantic. In theory. In practice, it was freezing, itchy, and entirely dependent on your ability to make rhyming couplets under pressure. It began with whispers. Whispers of sails shaped like dragon wings, of warriors with iron beards and eyes like frozen seas. The Seine had always been a lifeline for Paris, wide, proud, serene. But in the spring of 845, the river became a warning. The Frankish towns along the coast fell silent one by one. No bells, no smoke from hearths, just drifting wreckage and blood on the tide. When the news reached Paris, it wasn't a question of if the Norsemen would come. It was when, and how bad it would be this time. But this wasn't just any raid. This wasn't a loose band of sea raiders looking for gold and sheep. This was Ragnar Lodbrok. To the Franks, his name sounded like thunder cracking through a church roof. Ragnar, the man who had once claimed descent from Odin himself. Ragnar, whose sons would go on to terrorize Europe, but who, at this moment, was very much alive, charismatic, and foaming at the mouth for plunder. With 120 longships and more than 5,000 warriors at his back, he didn't sneak toward Paris. He announced himself. His sails cast shadows on the riverbanks. The rhythm of oars churned the Seine like the march of fate. Every monastery and village along the river was looted, burned, or enslaved. The Franks prayed. Their king, Charles the Bald, scrambled to assemble defences, but his realm was already stretched thin by civil war and infighting. The church screamed for divine intervention. The nobles argued over which bridge to defend. Meanwhile, Ragnar kept rowing. He didn't need siege engines or complex strategies. He had fire, he had fear, and he had time. Parisians stood atop their half-finished walls and watched as the river darkened with approaching death. Mothers hid their children in wine cellars. Priests tightened their grip on relics. And the king's messengers, sweaty, terrified, barely literate, begged neighbouring cities for reinforcements that would never arrive in time. The Norse were no longer myths whispered in the tavern. They were real. And they were here. And at their helm stood Ragnar, laughing, wild, and ready to make history. There was no mistaking them. Long, narrow hulls skimming the river like serpents, their prows carved into snarling beasts, eyes painted to ward off evil. Except this time, the evil was already on board. Ragnar's fleet wasn't a ragtag group of fishermen turned raiders. These were professionals, hardened by years of conquest in England, Ireland, and the North Sea. Each longship was a floating war machine, rowed by men who measured time by battles and blood. Their shields hung in neat rows along the sides, forming a wall of painted death. Behind them stood warriors with braided hair and tattooed arms, some clad in chainmail stolen from Frankish corpses, others bare-chested and smeared with mud and ash for intimidation. And it worked. As Ragnar's ships moved up the Seine, every village and abbey along the way became a rehearsal for the main act. Paris. Churches were torched. Clergymen were slaughtered or dragged off in chains. Frankish soldiers who dared resist were skewered and tossed into the river. And if the villagers were lucky, they were merely robbed. If not, they were put to the torch with everything they owned. Ragnar made sure to leave survivors, not out of mercy, but as a tactic. He wanted word of his wrath to reach Paris before he did. He wanted the city to stew in its own dread, and it worked. What made this fleet so terrifying wasn't just the numbers, it was the coordination. These weren't frenzied berserkers attacking blindly. Ragnar divided his forces like a chess master. Some raided inland, looting monasteries like Saint-Denis. Others guarded the ships. And always the river was their highway and lifeline. And then, like some cruel theatrical crescendo, they reached the gates of Paris, the Frankish capital. Still reeling from civil wars, famine and plague, now had to face an army that didn't negotiate, only pillaged. At the city walls, Ragnar ordered the burning of captured Frankish villages within sight of the gates. Smoke rose like a dark prophecy. He wasn't just threatening the city, he was daring them to stop him. And as the flames reflected off the Seine and onto his painted sails, Ragnar looked at the stone walls of Paris. Not with fear or reverence, but with hunger. Because for Ragnar, Paris wasn't a challenge, it was a prize. Paris, in 845, was not yet the towering fortress of later centuries. It was a city huddled on an island, the Ile de la Cité, flanked by 2 wooden bridges and protected by makeshift walls. Its defenders were few, mostly local militia, monks with swords, and nobles more interested in their titles than warfare. In short, it was dinner for Ragnar. The Viking chieftain wasted no time. Upon arrival, he launched a probing attack on the outskirts, testing the resolve of the defenders. What he found was laughable. The Frankish response was disorganized, slow, and terrified. So Ragnar pushed forward, laying siege to the heart of Paris. He divided his forces, surrounding the island from both riverbanks. The Seine belonged to him now, no boats in, no boats out. Trade stopped. Food trickled in. Panic trickled out. Ragnar's men set up campfires on every side, playing dice, drinking mead, and sharpening blades just within earshot of the city walls. They knew the waiting game well. The longer the siege, the weaker the prey. Paris tried to resist. Archers were placed along the bridges. Bells rang constantly. Priests held mass 3 times a day, begging divine intervention while ignoring the stench of fear in the air. The Franks attempted a counterattack, a sortie from one of the bridges, but it ended in disaster. Ragnar's men feigned retreat, lured the Franks into open terrain, and ambushed them. Bodies floated back to the city, bloated and broken. Ragnar, ever the showman, escalated things. He captured dozens of Frankish soldiers during a skirmish. Instead of holding them for ransom, he crucified them, right there on the riverbanks. He left their bodies for all Paris to see, as if to say, "Your prayers mean nothing to me." Inside the walls, famine began its slow creep. With every passing day, food stocks dwindled, morale cracked, and disease spread. The people looked to their king, Charles the Bald, but he was nowhere to be seen. He had fled to safety while his capital burned. And Ragnar? He wasn't even sweating. He sat by the fire, sharpening an axe, watching the smoke rise from the churches he'd torched, and smiling. The siege wasn't just working, it was becoming a masterpiece. While Paris smouldered and starved, King Charles the Bald was experiencing a royal meltdown. From the safety of his distant court, he paced, prayed, and panicked. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not on his watch. He was a Carolingian king, a descendant of Charlemagne, the hammer of pagans. Yet here he was, being outmaneuvered by a pagan pirate with excellent cheekbones and a penchant for setting things on fire. Charles had problems. The first was his fractured kingdom. The Frankish Empire had splintered into rival factions, and Charles's own nobles had the loyalty of wet bread. Every call for reinforcements was met with excuses. "We're guarding our own lands," or "Good luck, your majesty." No one wanted to throw their troops into Ragnar's meat grinder. The second problem was money, or the lack of it. The treasury was thin, drained by years of internal conflict and religious spending sprees. But worse than that was the humiliation. Paying off Vikings was a stain on royal honour. Still, Charles was running out of options, and honour wouldn't keep his throne warm if Ragnar decided to sack the capital. So he tried bargaining. Messengers were dispatched with frantic offers, gold, supplies, even titles if the Vikings would just leave. But Ragnar didn't flinch. He didn't want empty promises. He wanted Paris, and he was willing to wait until the people inside started eating each other. Then came the desperate gamble. Charles assembled a last-minute army. Nothing grand, just a patchwork force of half-trained peasants, local counts, and anyone willing to trade their lives for a handful of silver. Their mission? Break the siege and rescue the city. It went exactly as you'd expect. Ragnar caught wind of the plan before the first boot hit the riverbank. His men ambushed the relief force near the outskirts. What followed was a slaughter. Charles's reinforcements were butchered, routed, or captured. Those captured were executed with Ragnar's usual flair. Some hanged from trees, others used for target practice. Back in his court, Charles received the news like a punch to the liver. He had failed. His army had failed. Paris was out of time. And so, swallowing his pride like bitter ale, Charles reached for the last card in his deck. The bribe. Because when swords fail, gold speaks. In the end, it wasn't faith, fire, or Frankish steel that saved Paris. It was silver. Lots and lots of silver. Charles the Bald, out of armies and excuses, did what every ruler dreads. He cut a deal. It wasn't brave. It wasn't glorious. It was survival. And it came with a humiliating price tag, 7,000 livres of silver. That's over 2.5 tons of treasure, enough to bankrupt a region, and enough to make Ragnar's beard twitch with amusement. But Charles wasn't negotiating from strength. He was negotiating from his knees. His envoys approached Ragnar's camp with trembling hands and bulging coin sacks. No fanfare, no threats, just a desperate plea. Take the silver, leave the city, and maybe, just maybe, leave us some dignity. Ragnar, being a professional, didn't gloat. At least not immediately. He listened, squinted thoughtfully, and probably pretended to consider rejecting the offer for dramatic effect. But of course, he took it. He hadn't dragged 5,000 warriors across half of Francia just to play demolition derby with some underwhelming walls. He came for treasure, and the Frankish king had just opened the vault. The handover wasn't ceremonial. It was transactional. Chest after chest of silver was carted down to the Viking ships. The Franks looked on in silence. The Vikings looked on with glee. Some danced, others drank. A few openly debated whether they should take the money and sack the city anyway. But Ragnar, ever the tactician, chose reputation over greed. By accepting the ransom and sparing Paris, he sent a louder message than any torch or axe could. I can break you, but I don't have to. Just pay me. It was economic warfare, nor sedition. The Franks were stunned. Their king had just paid a fortune to a pagan warlord and let him sail away untouched. The clergy choked on their incense. The nobles seethed behind closed doors. But the citizens? They were just relieved to be alive. The siege lifted. The bridges were cleared. The fires died out. And Ragnar? He loaded the silver, raised his sails, and began the journey home. Victorious, untouched, paid like a king by a man who actually was one. And behind him, Paris stood smouldering, not in ruins, but in shame. With silver clinking in his hull and smoke curling in the distance, Ragnar turned his longships back down the Seine, not as a raider fleeing, but as a conqueror departing on his own terms. His warriors sang, their voices echoing off the riverbanks like the final laugh of a villain who got away with everything. Ragnar hadn't just won a battle, he'd won a myth. As the fleet drifted downstream, they passed the same ruined villages, scorched abbeys, and looted monasteries they had ravaged on the way up. Nothing stood in their path. The Franks wouldn't dare, not after what had happened in Paris, not after seeing their king reduced to a checkbook. Some legends say Ragnar had his ship so weighed down with silver that he had to jettison some of it into the river to stay afloat. Others claim he paraded the crucified Frankish prisoners as a parting gift. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Ragnar left Francia richer, more infamous, and completely unscathed. There were no real attempts to stop him. Charles the Bald, licking his wounds, had no appetite for another humiliation. And even if he did, he no longer had the resources, or the trust of his people, to do anything about it. He'd paid off the wolf, and now had to live with the scent of blood on his doorstep. For Ragnar, the journey home was more than a retreat. It was a victory parade. His reputation exploded across Europe. To the Norse, he was a legend made flesh, proof that the gods favoured the bold. To the Franks, he was a nightmare they couldn't wake from. To other Viking leaders, he was now the gold standard for raiding. Burn, terrorise, and then get paid to leave. The psychological wound left behind was deeper than any blade. After all, Ragnar hadn't breached Paris with ladders or siege engines. He broke it with fear, fire, and audacity. And that may have been the most terrifying part. He could have taken the city, but he didn't need to. As the dragon-headed ships disappeared over the horizon, one fact remained crystal clear. Ragnar Lodbrok had just robbed one of the most powerful kings in Christendom and sailed away without a scratch. The age of the Viking was no longer coming. It had arrived. When the dragon ships vanished and the river went quiet, Paris didn't celebrate. It exhaled, slowly, shakily, like a city waking from a nightmare. The siege was over, but the trauma had just begun. The city reeked of smoke and sweat and unwashed fear. Its bridges were scorched, its churches desecrated, its streets littered with the bones of failed resistance. And while the walls still technically stood, the idea of safety had been reduced to ash. People crept out from cellars and crypts with hollow eyes, as if expecting the Norse to come back and finish the job. The first thing to return wasn't hope, it was blame. Fingers pointed in every direction. The clergy blamed the king for his cowardice. The nobles blamed each other for not sending aid. The people blamed both. And hovering above it all was the bitter truth. Charles the Bald had paid off the enemy and left his capital city to rot. There was no spinning it as a tactical retreat or clever diplomacy. Everyone knew what it was, a payout born of panic. The church tried to paint the survival of Paris as a divine miracle, a test of faith, or a sign of future redemption. But the people knew better. It wasn't angels who had spared them. It was silver. To make matters worse, the ransom had gutted the royal treasury. Inflation rose. Taxes soared. Monasteries wept over their stolen relics. The countryside, already weary from years of civil war and famine, buckled further. And with each passing day, the legend of Ragnar Lodbrok grew taller, while the authority of the Carolingian throne grew smaller. Militarily, the implications were even more damning. Ragnar had exposed the soft underbelly of Frankish defences. He didn't need catapults or battering rams. He just needed a river and a cause. Other Norse leaders took note. If Paris could be shaken so easily, what else was ripe for the taking? And perhaps most haunting of all was the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A prelude. A warning. Paris had survived, yes. But it had also been humiliated, scarred, and forced to buy its own life. That kind of wound doesn't fade quickly. And in the smoky silence that followed, one question lingered over every broken gate and prayer-stained floor. What happens when the next Ragnar arrives? The raid on Paris in 845 didn't end when Ragnar sailed home. In truth, it began something far more enduring, a legacy of terror, strategy, and cultural domination that echoed through Europe for generations. Other Viking leaders, upon hearing what Ragnar had accomplished, took notes, and then took ships. Word of the Frankish ransom spread quickly through the north, and with it came a revelation. You didn't have to die gloriously in battle to make your mark. You could die wealthy too. Ragnar had shown that gold flowed more freely from frightened kings than from burning cities. Soon, raiders from Denmark, Norway and Sweden began targeting the Seine, the Loire and the Rhine. They weren't just reckless marauders anymore. They were businessmen with axes. Viking raids became annual events in Francia, like grim, blood-stained holidays. Each summer brought new fleets, new demands, and new ransoms. Ragnar's playbook became doctrine. Sail fast, strike hard, terrify everyone, and get paid to leave. Cities began stockpiling silver not for trade, but for protection. Monasteries buried their holy relics and relics of saints, not out of piety but out of fear. The Frankish response? Fortify and pray. But it wasn't enough. In time, the Viking raids turned into settlements. First were winter camps, then fortresses, then towns. By the end of the 9th century, Norsemen had carved out permanent footholds in Francia, including the area that would become Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen. It all traced back to Ragnar's siege of Paris. And Ragnar? His legend grew beyond the battlefield. Songs were sung, sagas were told. Some say he later attacked Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, was thrown into a pit of snakes and laughed as he died. Others claim he lived out his days in comfort, watching his sons tear Europe apart in his name. Whatever the truth, the Viking image of Ragnar, the cunning, brutal, unshakable warlord, was now immortal. He was no longer just a man, he was a model for how a single leader could exploit a fractured kingdom, crack its pride, and sail away a legend. The siege of Paris was not just a Viking success, it was a template for Viking domination. Paris survived, but it would never be the same. The memory of Ragnar's siege carved itself into the stone of the city, into the nightmares of its clergy, and into the policy of every king who followed Charles the Bald. It wasn't just a story, it was a warning, a reminder that even the mightiest city could be brought to its knees by a man in a longship with nothing but fire, grit, and a greedy grin. The Frankish response in the decades that followed was nothing short of paranoid. Paris began to fortify, not just with thicker walls and sturdier bridges, but with policy. River traffic was monitored, watchtowers rose like angry sentinels along the Seine, and the monarchy, bruised and humiliated, slowly clawed its way back to respectability by reforming the military and centralizing power. Eventually, these painful lessons laid the groundwork for what would become the Capetian dynasty, the future of France. But trauma lingered. To the average Parisian, the name Ragnar wasn't legendary, it was personal. Parents used it to frighten children into obedience. Do your chores or the Northmen will come. Merchants and monks alike remembered the screams in the streets, the black smoke, and the silence that followed. And even as the years passed, whenever a foreign sail appeared on the horizon, old men muttered, "They've come again." Yet the legacy wasn't all fear. The siege catalyzed a strange cultural exchange, albeit one soaked in blood. Viking mercenaries would one day serve Frankish kings. Norse settlers in Normandy would become Christian lords. The enemy at the gates would become the knights in the court. It was ironic, almost poetic, that the very culture that once looted Paris would later defend it. Still, deep in the DNA of the city, something had changed. Ragnar's siege had shattered the illusion of invincibility. Paris was not untouchable. It had been bought, broken and spared, and the city never forgot that bitter lesson. Every archbishop who blessed a sword, every tax collector who weighed a coin, every soldier who manned a wall, each was acting in the long shadow of 845. Because when one man, armed with only iron, fire and nerve, can make an empire tremble and a king pay up, the world notices, and the world, forever after, changed. In the Middle Ages, the road to salvation didn't start in a church pew, it started with blisters. To be a good Christian wasn't just about going to Mass or confessing your sins. Sometimes it meant putting one foot in front of the other and walking for hundreds of miles to visit a holy site. These journeys were called pilgrimages, and they were both deeply spiritual and absurdly physical. Picture a barefoot farmer trudging through rain, snow, and occasionally cow dung, all to stand in front of a saint's knucklebone in a gilded box. The motivation? Eternal salvation, or at the very least, divine brownie points. The church heavily promoted pilgrimages as a way to earn indulgences. Committed adultery? Go to Santiago. Lied to a priest? Try Canterbury. Murdered someone? Well, maybe start walking to Jerusalem and don't stop. But it wasn't always about guilt. Pilgrimage could be an act of gratitude, a request for healing, or just an excuse to leave your village without being labelled a heretic. For women, it was one of the few ways to travel with some social acceptance. For knights, it was a detour from stabbing people to prove how holy they were. And for many, it was just the only vacation they were ever going to get. The call to pilgrimage came in many forms: a dream, a sermon, or the sharp nudge of a local priest saying, "You know, God might forgive you if you walk 800 miles with a sore back and no shoes." It wasn't uncommon for families to send a representative pilgrim, kind of like spiritual outsourcing. One person walking could supposedly earn blessings for the whole clan. Lucky them. Once committed, pilgrims received a blessing and donned the telltale signs: a staff, a satchel, and a distinctive badge, often shaped like a scallop shell or a cross. These symbols marked them as holy wanderers, not vagrants, which was an important distinction when sleeping in barns and begging for food. But make no mistake, a pilgrimage wasn't a stroll in the countryside. It was a journey laced with exhaustion, uncertainty, and a faint hope that at the end of the road, something divine would be waiting. That is, if the road didn't kill you first. Before the first step on the dusty road, the medieval pilgrim faced a dilemma. What to bring when you're about to walk 1,000 miles on foot, with no Amazon delivery, no waterproof boots, and definitely no snack bars? The answer? As little as humanly possible, but still too much. Pilgrims packed their lives into a satchel the size of a modern handbag. Weight was the enemy. Every extra tunic meant 1 more ounce to carry across mountains, swamps, and bandit-ridden woods. And so, they brought the barest of essentials: a spare linen shift, if you were lucky, a bit of dried food, a flask or water skin, and maybe, just maybe, a small religious token to remind you that your suffering was entirely on purpose. Then came the staff. This wasn't a hiking accessory, it was a multifunctional miracle stick. You used it to walk, to defend yourself against wild dogs or wild people, to test the depth of mud pits, and sometimes to prod snoring fellow pilgrims in church. Your hat had to be wide-brimmed for sun and rain, and preferably pilgrim chic. Bonus points if it had a scallop shell pinned to it, the universal badge of pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. That shell could grant you access to monasteries, soup kitchens, and free hay in barns. Think of it as your medieval passport, except it didn't expire, and everyone knew you were probably broke. Footwear was another misery entirely. Most pilgrims wore sandals or low-leather shoes, barely better than going barefoot. Blisters weren't a possibility. They were a guarantee. Many wrapped their feet in linen and prayed they wouldn't rot before reaching the next shrine. For food, you didn't pack much. Instead, you relied on the kindness of strangers, monasteries, or fellow pilgrims. And kindness might mean a bowl of onion soup with a side of dry bread. If you were too proud to beg, congratulations. You were also too proud to eat. perhaps the most essential item wasn't even physical, a letter of pilgrimage. This document, issued by the church, proved you weren't just a wandering bum. It was your holy permission slip, and without it, you might end up in jail instead of heaven. So with aching feet, an overloaded sack, and a silent prayer, the pilgrim set out. Because when packing for the afterlife, there's no such thing as travelling light. Once you left the comfort of your village, or whatever passed for comfort in medieval Europe, you entered the vast, unpredictable theatre of the road. And the road didn't care about your prayers. Let's start with the terrain. Medieval roads were not roads in the modern sense. They were glorified footpaths, or muddy death traps depending on the weather. Rain turned everything into soup. Snow hid wolves. And summer? Summer cooked your flesh and attracted every biting insect between Normandy and Jerusalem. Bandits were a constant threat. Pilgrims were easy prey, unarmed, poorly fed, and often carrying small amounts of coin or religious trinkets worth selling. A pilgrim walking alone was basically a mobile donation box with legs. Even travelling in groups wasn't always safe. Some thieves dressed as fellow pilgrims to blend in. Nothing says betrayal like getting robbed by a guy wearing the same scallop shell as you. Then there were the animals. Wolves, bears, wild boars, all ready to remind you that being eaten alive could also be considered penance. Dogs roamed freely and were less man's best friend, and more territorial monsters with mange. One wrong turn through the woods, and you weren't just off course, you were on the menu. But even more treacherous than bandits or beasts was temptation. Pilgrimage routes were lined with taverns, brothels and gambling pits, especially near large towns. Some pilgrims never made it past the first city before their vow of piety turned into a haze of wine, dice and regret. The church disapproved, of course, but the tavern owners? They welcomed your soul's downfall with open arms and cheap ale. Even your fellow pilgrims could be a problem. There were scammers, freeloaders, and self-proclaimed prophets preaching strange visions in exchange for food. Arguments erupted over sleeping space, directions, and who smelled worse. You could be halfway to Rome and suddenly find yourself in a heated debate about the Virgin Mary with a barefoot fisherman from Flanders. And yet, somehow, most kept walking. The journey was part endurance test, part spiritual obstacle course. Every mud-drenched mile, every wolf howling in the distance, every temptation resisted or shamefully indulged. It all became part of the story, part of the sacrifice. Because holiness wasn't earned inside the cathedral. It was earned with every blistered step in the mud. After weeks or months of hobbling through filth, hunger and sin, the pilgrim finally saw it. Rising above the hills, a spire, a dome, or a shimmering shrine, the holy site, the place where miracles supposedly happened. And it was, usually smaller than expected. Whether it was the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, the bones of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, or a suspiciously well-preserved toe of St. Margaret somewhere in France, the destination varied, but the vibe remained. Sacred hype. These sites were the medieval version of Disneyland, but instead of roller coasters you got sacred relics, candlelight processions and the occasional exorcism. The relics themselves were the main attraction. But let's be honest, medieval Europe had a bit of a relic inflation problem. There were enough splinters of the true cross to build a forest. Everyone claimed to have the skull of John the Baptist, sometimes 3 in the same city. But authenticity wasn't really the point. Belief was. Pilgrims would crawl on their knees to reach the relic. Some wept, others fainted. Many simply touched the shrine and whispered a desperate prayer. Heal my blindness, forgive my adultery, fix my aching back. The belief was that saints had posthumous superpowers, and their bones could still grant miracles like medieval vending machines. And where there were miracles, there was money. Towns built around these shrines profited enormously. Inns, taverns, trinket sellers, and monks with suspiciously high prices for special blessings thrived. You could buy candles, holy water, amulets, and even tiny flasks allegedly filled with saintly sweat. For the right price, your soul could get an express lane to forgiveness. The church encouraged it. Pilgrimage sites brought prestige, donations, and a steady stream of religious tourism. Entire cathedrals were built just to house a single toe or dried-up tunic. And the more dramatic the legend behind the relic, the bigger the crowds. Bleeding statues? Check. Incorruptible bodies? Absolutely. Talking skulls? You bet someone claimed it. But even amid the spectacle, many pilgrims found genuine awe. Standing in candle-lit silence before a golden reliquary after surviving the brutal road felt like arriving at the edge of heaven. It may not have looked like much, but to a weary soul, that shrine was everything. Pilgrimage wasn't just a spiritual journey, it was big business. Every step a pilgrim took meant coins changing hands. Inns, taverns, blacksmiths, relic vendors, and even beggars depended on the flow of the faithful. And when hundreds or even thousands of pilgrims funneled through a town each year, the local economy didn't just survive, it thrived. Enter the pilgrim trap. A village with a mediocre shrine would suddenly experience a vision, a miracle, or a goat giving birth with a crucifix-shaped mark on its side. The next thing you knew, a chapel popped up, candles were lit, and someone was charging 3 denarii for a look at a finger bone allegedly belonging to Saint someone or other. Tourists came, merchants followed, and the church gave its blessing, after collecting a tidy cut of the offerings, of course. The most profitable sites, like Santiago de Compostela, became pilgrimage mega-hubs. Entire industries sprang up. Cloak weavers for the dusty traveller, cobblers to patch torn shoes, and bakers who made dry, durable bread that could last through weeks of misery. You could even find medieval pilgrim guides, men who promised protection and directions, for a price. Sometimes they were legitimate. Sometimes they were just well-dressed robbers with a contract. Merchants sold souvenirs by the wagon load. Little tin badges shaped like the shrine's relic were worn proudly by pilgrims, signalling where they'd been like medieval travel stickers. You could even buy fake ones if you were too lazy or too smart to walk the whole route. Monasteries played a major role too. Far from being spiritual retreats, many operated like well-oiled hospitality machines. Monks would welcome pilgrims with beds and bowls of soup, but not without a suggested donation. Some were genuinely kind. Others had a knack for holy pricing. And then there were the scammers. Forged relics, staged miracles, fake monks, and self-declared holy men who promised divine healing in exchange for all your worldly possessions. Pilgrims had to walk a fine line between faith and foolishness. Still, most participated willingly. They knew the game. They were part of it. And after all, wasn't their own salvation worth a few coins? In the end, the road to heaven might have been lined with prayer, but it was paved with silver. Despite the loneliness of the road, very few pilgrims walked entirely alone. Safety in numbers was the rule, not the exception. Groups formed organically, people from the same village, tradesmen heading the same way, or strangers who simply had the same limp and the same goal. Like a medieval backpacker hostel, these bands were chaotic, noisy, and weirdly intimate. And they were never boring. Group dynamics ranged from touching solidarity to full-blown chaos. One day you were sharing crusty bread under a tree. The next you were yelling at someone for stealing your turnip. Pilgrims came from every walk of life. Nobles, peasants, monks, widows, merchants, and criminals doing penance. What could possibly go wrong? Language barriers didn't help. A German pilgrim might walk with an English farmer and a Breton nun. The result? A lot of pointing, miming, and occasional fights about who got the dry sleeping spot under the eaves of a barn. Disputes were common. Over food, over pace, over whose relic badge was shinier. Some took pilgrim vows of silence, which helped, until someone tripped over their bag and broke a flask of holy water. Then all vows were off. Still, amid the squabbles, something deeper often formed: camaraderie. Sharing a road full of mud, illness, and divine fear tended to strip people down to their basics. You laughed at the same ridiculous sights. You carried each other when someone got sick. You prayed together when wolves howled too close. You wept when someone died along the route, which happened far more often than anyone liked to admit. There were also moments of strange joy, spontaneous singing, storytelling around a fire, acts of kindness from total strangers, a shared loaf, a dry cloak, or a silent hand on a shoulder at a shrine. It wasn't all suffering. Some pilgrims said the fellowship was the best part. Many returned home with new friends, letters from foreign places, or tales of that one Italian guy who could juggle knives and recite psalms. Others parted ways quietly, slipping away at a fork in the road with a nod and a prayer. Because on the pilgrim road, people came and went like clouds, but the journey always kept moving forward. Not every pilgrim walked with pure intentions. Sure, many set off with sincere goals, penance, healing, a fresh start. But the medieval world, like ours, was full of contradictions. And nowhere did piety and pride collide more hilariously than on the pilgrimage trail. Some pilgrims were more concerned with how they were seen than why they walked. These were the ones who made sure everyone knew how far they'd come, how much they'd suffered, and how often they'd prayed on a single loaf of mouldy bread. Humility? Optional. Dramatic storytelling? Absolutely required. Then came the fashion pilgrims. Yes, really. Wealthy nobles often dressed the part of a humble traveller, but with expensive cloaks, engraved staffs, and embroidered satchels. They would hire servants to carry their luggage, and sometimes even ride horses the majority of the way, because nothing says spiritual suffering like a portable feather mattress. And while most pilgrims walked every agonizing mile, others found shortcuts, literal and spiritual. Some hired carriages for parts of the journey, or paid others to carry them. A few simply bought pilgrimage badges at the market and skipped the entire trip. Why risk wolves and dysentery when you could fake it with a shiny tin shell and a good lie? But spiritual cheating had consequences. The church frowned on what it called false pilgrims. Some towns even posted guards on major pilgrimage roads to check papers and verify intentions. But enforcement was spotty, and loopholes were many. As long as you rang the right bells and dropped the right coins in the collection box, few asked questions. Yet even among the cheats and the peacocks, genuine piety still burned. Many pilgrims confessed daily, walked barefoot, or subjected themselves to extreme discomfort for the sake of their souls. Some even carried heavy crosses, or whipped themselves along the way. Others walked in silence, or swore off meat, wine, or even speech until they reached their holy goal. The line between devotion and display was thin, and often trampled by muddy feet and human nature. Because in the end, pilgrimage wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, limping, sweaty, occasionally lying about your blisters, but walking the road anyway. Eventually, every pilgrimage came to an end, either at a shrine, a grave, or, for the lucky ones, back home. But coming home wasn't always the triumphant return many envisioned. First, there were the physical realities. Most pilgrims returned with fewer teeth, fewer coins, and many more scars, both literal and emotional. Feet were permanently mangled, backs hunched, and some had acquired strange illnesses with names no village healer could pronounce. You didn't just bring home a badge. You brought home trauma, tendinitis, and tales of a Flemish man who snored like a war horn. Then came the expectations. Villages often greeted returning pilgrims with ceremony. You were supposed to be holier now, wiser, more serene. People expected you to pray harder, sin less, and maybe smell like frankincense. Instead, many pilgrims stumbled home starving, irritable, and far more interested in beer than blessings. Some came home disappointed. They had walked hundreds of miles, kissed the bones of a saint, wept at the altar, and nothing changed. No miracle, no divine voice. Their disease remained. Their guilt lingered. The only thing that felt lighter was their wallet. For these pilgrims, disillusionment hit harder than a bandits' club. Others, however, returned transformed, not because of relics or rituals, but because of the road itself. Walking day after day, meeting strangers, seeing distant lands, it cracked open their understanding of the world. Some became storytellers, some joined monasteries. Others simply became more patient with their neighbours' loud chickens. The road taught them humility, empathy, and endurance in a way no sermon could. And let's not forget the bragging rights. Pilgrimage badges were worn like armour in the village tavern. A tin scallop shell from Santiago, that was worth a free drink. A scrap of cloth from Jerusalem. You'd be telling that story until the day you died. Whether the journey had changed your soul or not, it definitely upgraded your reputation. Even those who had cheated or failed to complete the journey found a strange kind of peace in trying. The attempt itself became the offering. Because in the Middle Ages, to return from pilgrimage, changed or not, meant one thing. You had dared to walk the road to heaven, and somehow made it back. Though centuries have passed and jet planes have replaced blistered feet, the echoes of medieval pilgrimage still shape our world. In its time, pilgrimage was more than a personal journey, it was a cultural engine. Routes like the Camino de Santiago, the Via Francigena, and the road to Canterbury helped stitch medieval Europe together. Pilgrims crossed borders, shared stories, swapped dialects, and accidentally built the foundation for something revolutionary, a shared European identity. Roads improved because of pilgrims. Hostels and hospitals were built for them. Villages became towns, towns became cities. Commerce followed the pilgrims' dusty boots, and in many cases remained long after they had gone. Today, many modern highways trace the same paths trodden by thousands of medieval feet. Spiritually, pilgrimage redefined how people understood faith. Before, salvation was locked behind church doors and Latin prayers. But pilgrimage made it tactile. You could walk toward it. You could suffer for it. You could earn it, 1 mile at a time. But the legacy wasn't just physical or spiritual. It was deeply human. The Pilgrim's Road became a metaphor for struggle, for transformation, for the painful, sometimes ridiculous process of trying to become better. It was never about perfection. It was about movement, about intention, about showing up, muddy, flawed, and hopeful. Today, people still walk those ancient routes. Some do it for fitness, some for fun, some because they lost something or someone and need time to process. The scallop shell still appears on backpacks and walking sticks. The trailside hostels still welcome the footsore. The prayers may be whispered in different tongues now, but they still rise into the sky above the same dusty roads. Even those who've never walked a pilgrimage can feel its weight in our culture. In literature, film, and even social media journeys, where we watch someone try to find themselves by leaving everything behind. Because the medieval pilgrimage wasn't about arriving, it was about becoming. The legacy lives on not in the shrines, but in the choice to keep walking. Even when the road is long, the shoes don't fit, and the miracles feel far away. Because maybe the real relic wasn't a saint's bone in a box. It was the pilgrim who returned home, still broken, but walking anyway. In a world without weekend football matches or celebrity boxing, the medieval tournament was the ultimate spectacle, and nothing electrified the noble class quite like the arrival of an official tournament proclamation. Wax-sealed, finely scripted, and delivered by a herald on horseback, it wasn't just an invitation, it was a public challenge. If you were a knight worth your salt, your honour practically required you to show up and be thrown off a horse. Tournaments didn't just happen. They were orchestrated with the care of a royal wedding and the budget of a minor crusade. Local lords or powerful monarchs hosted them to show off their wealth, attract alliances, and maybe marry off a conveniently single daughter or two. Days, sometimes weeks, were set aside for feasting, jousting, melees, archery, pageantry, and low-level chaos. For the knights receiving these invitations, the stakes were high. A tournament was where reputations were made or shattered, often along with a few bones. It was an opportunity to display skill, bravery, and fashion sense, all in front of the watching eyes of ladies, lords, and rival knights. A single victory could lead to marriage proposals, land grants, or at the very least, a few poems written in your honour by someone with a lute. But the invitation wasn't open to everyone. You had to be of noble birth, or at least fake it well. Heraldry was checked, ancestry debated. No one wanted a commoner sneaking in with a forged coat of arms. That would have been scandalous, or worse, embarrassing if he won. Preparation began immediately. Armour was polished, horses were trained, tailors were summoned. A knight didn't just need to fight well, he had to look the part. Your surcoat needed to gleam. Your family crest had to be visible from 50 paces, and your lance balanced to the ounce. Whispers of rivalries also travelled with the invitation. Had Sir Baldwin insulted Sir Geoffrey's sister last tournament? Was Sir Rowland still bitter about being unhorsed by a younger knight with better hair? These scores would be settled with the thunder of hooves and the crash of steel. The moment that wax seal cracked, a knight's pulse quickened. Because the tournament wasn't just a game, it was war, made polite. Once the tournament was announced, the real work began, and for the knights that meant training. Brutal, relentless, and often slightly insane training. Because while tournaments were wrapped in pageantry and ceremony, they were still, at their core, organised violence on horseback. And if you weren't prepared, you weren't just going to lose. You were going to eat dirt in front of 1,000 spectators, and possibly a duchess. First, the joust, the iconic event. 2 knights, full tilt, lances down, aiming to explode each other's dignity and ribs. But landing a successful hit wasn't as simple as charging like a maniac. It required hours of drilling. Knights practiced against wooden quintains, rotating targets with shields on one side and a heavy sandbag on the other. Hit the shield too weakly, and you failed. Hit it off centre, and the sandbag swung around and smacked you in the head. Excellent motivation. Balance was everything. You had to aim a 12-foot lance at a moving target while galloping on a horse wearing 80 pounds of armour, without falling off yourself. Training involved strengthening core muscles, perfecting timing, and developing a relationship with your horse so tight you practically read each other's minds. A spooked or sluggish steed could ruin your whole shot, and your femur. Off the horse, knights sparred with swords, axes, and maces to prepare for the melee. Essentially a team brawl with fewer rules and more bruises. This was the part of the tournament that simulated real battle. It could last for hours, involve dozens of fighters, and frequently ended with dislocated shoulders, shattered noses, or unconscious noblemen being dragged out of the mud by their squires. And squires, they trained too. They were responsible for everything: hauling armour, tending horses, handing over weapons mid-fight, and patching up wounds with a mixture of herbs and panic. A good squire could mean the difference between glory and humiliation. A bad one might accidentally hand you your ceremonial sword instead of your battle-ready one. Oops. Training was exhausting, dangerous, sometimes deadly, but knights accepted it as part of the code. You didn't just train to win, you trained to survive. Because no matter how romantic the songs made it sound, tournaments weren't tales of gentle chivalry. They were battlefields with a dress code. Before a single lance was shattered, tournaments were already a battlefield of style. Knights didn't just arrive, they made an entrance. And everything from their surcoats to the embroidery on their horse blankets screamed one thing: status. You weren't just a fighter, you were a walking family brand, and your colours, symbols, and outfit choices spoke louder than any war cry. At the heart of this spectacle was heraldry, the medieval version of a resume, Instagram profile, and sports jersey rolled into one. Shields and banners displayed your coat of arms. lions for courage, crosses for piety, and mythical beasts for those who clearly had something to prove. Every colour, every pattern had meaning. Red for valour, gold for generosity, black for grief or vengeance. Or maybe you just liked the way it looked when it caught the sunlight. These symbols weren't just for flair. They helped identify knights under layers of armour. You might be helmeted, visored, and indistinguishable in the dust of the joust, but your heraldic device told everyone who was getting clobbered, and more importantly, whose reputation was being raised or ruined in front of the crowd. And oh, the crowd. Tournaments were public theatre. Nobles, townsfolk, visiting merchants, and romantic hopefuls all lined the pavilions, eager to see who looked the part of a hero. Knights often sponsored tailors to design striking surcoats and caparisons. That's fancy horse armour in case you're not fluent in medieval fashion. Bright colours, glittering threads, and intricate embroidery turned the lists into a runway of chainmail and swagger. But it wasn't just about personal branding. It was political. Your clothes signalled alliances, who you dined with, who your patron was. A knight might wear his lady's scarf tied to his arm, a not-so-subtle flex of courtly devotion and social connection. Others flaunted foreign styles to show they'd fought in exotic lands. Silk from the east? That meant crusader cred. Fur-lined gloves? Probably just showing off. Armour, too, was part of the fashion game. Beyond function, it was custom-made and often engraved or inlaid with precious metals. A rich knight might enter the field gleaming like a human chandelier, while a poorer one just hoped his dented helmet didn't fall off mid-charge. Because in the tournament world, looking good wasn't optional, it was strategy. Before a single lance lowered or sword was drawn, the tournament kicked off with pageantry that made royal coronations look like backyard barbecues. This was the grand procession, a slow-moving, dazzling parade of egos, armour and heraldry, designed to impress, intimidate, and charm the watching crowd. Knights rode in single file, their banners fluttering, horses adorned in flowing caparisons, and squires scurrying behind like stressed-out assistants. Each knight's name was announced by the heralds, who sometimes added spicy commentary like, "Victor of 3 past tournaments," or "He who once split a man's helmet clean in half." Modesty was not the mood. Ladies of the court watched from silk-draped stands, evaluating the contenders like medieval talent scouts. Noble lords sized up potential allies, or rivals. And among the cheering peasants, bets were already being placed. Would Sir Geoffrey unhorse that smug Italian again? Would someone fall off their horse in the opening bow? You never knew, and that was half the fun. After the parade came the oaths. One by one, knights stepped forward before the tournament judge, a high-ranking noble or even royalty, and swore to uphold the chivalric code. That meant no striking a man who had lost his helmet, no attacking from behind, and absolutely no stabbing your opponent once he was already on the ground. You know, the basics of not being a total lunatic. These oaths weren't just for show, they were public declarations of honour. Breaking them could result in fines, disqualification, or becoming the subject of a very unflattering ballad. But let's be honest. While many knights meant every word, others were already mentally editing their promises. I vow not to trample anyone, unless they insult my horse. Some tournaments added flair to the ritual. Knights might pledge their devotion to a lady, dedicate their performance to a saint, or declare a personal vow, like never retreating or never eating until victorious. Romantic? Absolutely. Reckless? Usually. The procession and oaths set the stage. They turned knights into characters, rivals into narratives, and the arena into a living story. Because for the medieval audience, this wasn't just sport. It was theatre, choreographed, glorified violence with a moral message and really expensive costumes. This was it. The main event. The moment the crowd hushed, the trumpets blared, and 2 knights prepared to hurtle toward each other at full gallop with 12-foot wooden poles, and the hope of not becoming medieval mulch. The joust wasn't just the highlight of the tournament, it was the stuff of legend, splinters, and occasional skull fractures. The arena, or tilt yard, was divided by a long wooden barrier called the tilt, designed to prevent horses from crashing into each other head-on. On either side, knights lined up on horseback, each armoured like a walking cathedral. Helmets were bolted tight, visors lowered, lances were levelled, and then, with a blast of trumpet and a cry from the herald, they charged. The goal? Strike your opponent cleanly on the shield, chest or helmet. A well-placed blow might snap your lance in a shower of dramatic wood splinters, earning cheers from the crowd and points from the judges. Unhorsing your opponent? That was the gold standard. But make no mistake, this was dangerous. Lances were blunted, yes, but blunted wood doesn't feel soft when it's travelling 30 miles per hour into your sternum. Injuries were common. Broken arms, shattered ribs, concussions, and teeth knocked so far back they became relics. Helmets dented in like ale cups. One unlucky knight was famously impaled through the eye slit, an accident that led to even stricter armour regulations. But even with all the risks, knights kept coming back. Because jousting wasn't just for honour, it was for status. A victory in the lists could mean instant fame. Nobles might offer patronage. Ladies might offer favours. You might even get your name immortalised in some bard's sweaty love ballad. And if you were a landless knight looking for a career boost, a few good tilts could be your ticket to power. But jousting wasn't all brute force. It was a test of precision, timing, and absolute control of your horse. One false move and you were flying sideways in a blur of shame and dirt. And yet, even with the pain, the bruises, and the very real possibility of getting poked in the spleen, jousting remained the centrepiece of chivalric culture. Because for a true knight, nothing screamed glory quite like getting launched off a horse in front of your crush. If the joust was a duel of finesse, the melee was a medieval mosh pit with weapons. Think of it as team-based carnage. Dozens of knights, broken into two sides, charging at each other in a sprawling field with swords, axes, maces, and the kind of chaotic enthusiasm usually reserved for tavern brawls. There were rules, sure, but they were more like suggestions. Try not to kill anyone, for example, was less a commandment and more a gentle reminder. The melee was meant to simulate real battlefield conditions, minus the arrows and screaming peasants. Knights fought in formations or solo, on horseback or on foot, often in rounds that lasted until someone called it off, or until the last man standing couldn't. Objectives varied. Sometimes it was just a wild free-for-all. Other times, teams fought to capture a standard, a banner or token, or to rescue a dummy representing a lady in distress. Chivalry, remember? While not as glamorous as jousting, the melee offered knights a different kind of fame. It showcased brute strength, endurance, and tactical smarts. You could show off your sword work, your horsemanship, and your ability to survive being repeatedly whacked by other armoured men. It was glorious, it was exhausting, and it was dangerous. Injuries were inevitable. Helmets cracked, shields shattered, bones snapped. Some melees were so brutal that knights were dragged out unconscious, or didn't get up at all. But as long as no one died on purpose, it was all part of the game. Squires darted in and out like pit crew, handing replacement weapons, pulling fallen knights from the mud, or dragging horses away from the fray. And all the while, nobles and ladies watched from shaded pavilions, sipping wine and cheering their favourite contenders, because nothing says romance like watching someone get elbowed in the helmet. For landless knights and younger sons, the melee was a golden opportunity. If you couldn't win a joust, you might shine in the chaos. Winning could earn coin, armour, and even a noble sponsor. Losing just meant bruises, and maybe a few weeks of painful, prayer-filled limping. But in a world obsessed with honour and spectacle, the melee was where true grit showed. Because nothing said knightly virtue like beating your enemies with a stick and looking good doing it. Let's be honest, part of why knights put themselves through bruised ribs and shattered egos was for the glory. But another part? The ladies were watching. Tournaments weren't just war games. They were social stages, and knights knew their every move could win more than just coin. It could win favour, admiration, or even a strategic marriage proposal. And no part of the tournament was more ripe for flirtation and performance than the moments between fights. Noble women didn't just sit in the stands fanning themselves and looking pretty. They were active participants in the pageantry. Many knights would dedicate their performance to a lady of their heart, sometimes tying a scarf, veil, or token from her hand to their lance as a symbol of devotion. This wasn't just sweet, it was calculated. If the knight performed well, the lady shared the glory. If he was unhorsed spectacularly, well, at least she didn't promise exclusivity. Ladies awarded prizes too, garlands, rings, or a kiss on the cheek for the victor. The crowd ate it up. These courtly rituals reinforced ideals of chivalry, fighting for love, for beauty, for something nobler than just your own pride. Of course, it also helped that said beauty was seated in a velvet pavilion surrounded by servants and luxury, while you were sweating into a steel bucket. But love at tournaments wasn't always innocent. Affairs bloomed, secret notes were passed, nobles gossiped. Some knights made careers out of seducing high-born women under the pretense of chivalric devotion. The church disapproved, loudly, but that never stopped anyone. And then there were the poets. Minstrels and troubadours travelled from tournament to tournament, turning heroic deeds and romantic disasters into rhymed performances. If you managed to win both the joust and the heart of a duchess, your name might echo in songs for years. If you fell off your horse trying to impress a baroness, that also made it into the ballads, just with more laughter. In a society where status was everything, being admired by noblewomen could make or break a knight's reputation. A whispered compliment from the right lady could carry more weight than a bag of silver. Because in the court of public opinion, love wasn't just a battlefield. It was part of the tournament. For all their chivalric vows and romantic flair, tournaments were messy, politically, physically, and morally. Beneath the gleaming armour and flowing banners lurked a whole underworld of scandal, cheating, and sheer medieval chaos. Let's start with the cheating. Knights were supposed to follow the rules. No striking an unarmed opponent, no killing blows, no foul play. But honour had a funny way of vanishing when coin and reputation were on the line. Some competitors secretly reinforced their lances with metal cores, making them much more dangerous and much less breakable. Others tampered with armour, removing padding for agility, or deliberately dulling their opponent's blade before a match. And if a knight had a grudge to settle, well, accidental brutality in the lists wasn't uncommon. Officials tried to enforce order. Marshals patrolled the fields, heralds recorded blows, and disputes were sometimes settled in front of noble judges. But bribes worked wonders. A well-timed pouch of silver could turn a disqualification into a slap on the wrist, especially if the accused knight was rich, well-connected, or throwing a feast that night. Then came the accidents, often indistinguishable from the cheating. Lances shattered in ways they weren't supposed to. Helmets flew off. Horses collapsed. One knight famously took a lance splinter through the eye slit, dying instantly. Another fell so hard he bit his tongue in half and was mute for life. These weren't freak outliers. They were part of the risk, and knights knew it. And yet, nothing stirred the crowd like a public scandal. Rivalries got personal. Drunken brawls broke out in the camps after dark. There were whispered affairs between knights and noblewomen, stolen prizes, switched identities, and at least one known case of a woman disguising herself as a knight to compete. When discovered, she was expelled from the lists, but not before winning 2 matches and thoroughly embarrassing half a dozen noblemen. Clerics disapproved of the whole scene. Tournaments, they said, encouraged vanity, violence, and sin. They weren't wrong, but they were ignored, because the nobility loved the drama, the people loved the blood, and knights loved the chance to play hero, until someone's visor caved in. In truth, for all its noble pretense, the tournament was never just about honour. It was a high-stakes game where cheating, blood, and gossip came free with admission. By the late Middle Ages, tournaments had morphed from rough-and-tumble war rehearsals into full-blown spectacles. More theatre than training, more pageant than peril. What started as practice for knights turned into a kind of medieval celebrity circuit. And like all great entertainment, it evolved with the times. Originally, tournaments were chaotic melees meant to mimic real combat. Knights honed skills they'd use in actual wars, charging in groups, dodging arrows, smashing skulls. But as battlefield tactics changed, so did the tournament. Plate armour became heavier, swords more ceremonial, and lances blunter. The event shifted focus from practical warfare to polished performance. By the 14th and 15th centuries, tournaments resembled something closer to a royal Broadway show. Elaborate costumes, painted shields, custom armour engraved with saints and house emblems. The nobles watching in the stands weren't looking for gritty survival. They wanted a good show. Think WWE with chainmail. Kings and queens began hosting tournaments less for military readiness and more for diplomacy. It was a way to display wealth, cement alliances, and entertain foreign guests. Henry VIII of England, for example, absolutely loved tournaments, especially when he was the one doing the jousting, until of course a head injury from a particularly nasty tilt may have permanently altered his personality. Oops. But as gunpowder entered the battlefield and the age of chivalric knights faded, so too did the relevance of the tournament. Firearms made armour obsolete, mounted charges became rare, and smashing your cousin off a horse just didn't prepare you for cannon fire. Still, the tournament's influence lingered. It birthed enduring symbols: the romanticised knight, the damsel's favour, the gleaming suit of armour. It shaped literature, from Arthurian legend to Shakespearean drama. And even today, echoes remain. Renaissance fairs, jousting reenactments, fantasy fiction filled with noble duels and elaborate tournaments. Every time someone in fiction raises a lance or challenges a rival in front of cheering crowds, they're drawing from this medieval tradition. The tournament may no longer dominate court calendars, but its legacy is undeniable. It combined violence with honour, chaos with choreography, and turned battlefield brutality into entertainment. Because in the end, the medieval tournament wasn't just about training knights, it was about creating legends with a splash of blood, a dash of scandal, and a whole lot of flair.